What would you do if someone called the cops on you? For mowing a lawn? Sounds absurd, right? Yet, for one teenager, what began as a simple, peaceful chore quickly spiraled into an unexpected clash with law enforcement and an even more shocking revelation that no one saw coming. This wasn't just an overreaction. It was a moment where deep-seated biases collided with reality in the most dramatic way possible. But the best part? This story isn't just about the trouble someone caused. It's about how karma has a way of stepping in when you least expect it. Stay tuned, because this tale of snap judgments and poetic justice will have you shaking your head one moment and grinning ear to ear the next. This isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call. It all began on a warm Saturday morning in a picturesque suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where the lawns are perfectly trimmed, the streets are quiet, and every mailbox matches. 16-year-old Jordan, a diligent and polite high school student, was spending his morning the way he often did, earning some extra cash by mowing lawns. Jordan wasn't just good at his job, he took pride in it. His clients, the Thompsons, had hired him for months. They were an elderly couple who loved their garden but couldn't tend to it anymore. For Jordan, this wasn't just work, it was a chance to help out and save money for his future. But not everyone in the neighborhood was as welcoming. Across the street, peeking out from behind her curtains, stood Mrs. Calloway. She was new to the block, but her reputation for being overly watchful and, let's be honest, a bit nosy had already spread. Mrs. Calloway noticed Jordan the moment he arrived. To most people, a teenager mowing a lawn wouldn't raise any eyebrows, but to Mrs. Calloway, it was enough to spark her suspicions. Her eyes narrowed as she watched him unload his tools. "Who is he?" she muttered to herself. "What's he doing here?" She saw his worn sneakers, his casual work clothes, and his focused demeanor. But instead of seeing a hard-working teen doing an honest job, Mrs. Calloway's mind raced to the worst possible conclusions. In her world, unfamiliar faces weren't just new, they were potential threats. She paced her living room, glancing back at him through the window. As Jordan carefully edged the flower beds, she convinced herself that something wasn't right. Her muttering grew louder. "Why haven't I seen him before? Is he really supposed to be here? What if he's up to something?" Her internal debate didn't last long. Before she knew it, Mrs. Calloway grabbed her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen for just a second before she dialed 911. I mean, seriously, Mrs. Calloway must have thought she cracked the case of the century, because clearly, lawn mowers are the latest tools in high-profile heists, right? When the dispatcher answered, Mrs. Calloway's voice was sharp and deliberate. "I'd like to report a suspicious individual," she began. She didn't mention the lawnmower. She didn't mention the neat rows of freshly trimmed grass. Instead, she painted a vague picture that implied Jordan was lurking where he shouldn't be. The dispatcher asked for more details, and Mrs. Calloway's tone grew more urgent. "He's been hanging around here for a while. I don't recognize him. He doesn't belong in this neighborhood." Her words were heavy with assumptions, but she didn't stop to think about the implications of her call. For her, it was simple. She felt uneasy, so someone else had to deal with it. Meanwhile, Jordan remained completely unaware of the storm brewing just across the street. He continued his work, carefully bagging grass clippings and wiping sweat from his brow. To him, it was just another day, but for Mrs. Calloway, this was far from routine. She stood by her window, waiting for the police to arrive. In her mind, she was the vigilant neighbor, protecting her community. She didn't realize her snap judgment was about to backfire in the most spectacular way. And Jordan? Well, he had no idea that his quiet Saturday morning was about to turn into an unforgettable encounter. Minutes passed, and the peaceful hum of Jordan's mower was suddenly interrupted by the screech of tires on the pavement. Two patrol cars appeared at the end of the block, their lights flashing brightly in the otherwise calm neighborhood. The sound of sirens cut through the air, sharp and jarring, as they came to a halt near the curb. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. He stood frozen, hands still on the mower's handle, unsure of what was happening. Imagine being a 16-year-old, trying to earn some extra cash on a Saturday morning, when out of nowhere, the police arrive. For what? Because you were mowing a lawn? He glanced over his shoulder at the officers, their serious expressions immediately making his stomach tighten. He was confused. but not intimidated. After all, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He'd been mowing lawns for years. He was just a kid doing a chore, nothing more. The officers approached slowly, their eyes scanning the area, before one of them spoke up. "Hey you," he called, his voice calm but firm. "What are you doing here?" Jordan wiped his brow, still holding the mower in place. I'm just mowing the Thompsons' lawn," he said, his voice steady. "I work for them. They're the elderly couple across the street." The officer looked at him for a moment, assessing his words, then nodded. "Can you give us your name?" "Jordan Drake," he replied, his brow furrowing. "Like I said, I'm working for them. I've done it for a while now." But before the officer could ask another question, a familiar voice shouted from the yard. "That boy doesn't belong here." Mrs. Calloway's shrill voice pierced the air as she stormed down her front steps, pointing a trembling finger directly at Jordan. The officers turned toward her, and Mrs. Calloway's accusations tumbled out like a flood. "He's up to no good. I saw him lurking around. I don't recognize him, and he doesn't belong in this neighborhood. You need to do something about him." The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. They'd heard the story, but something didn't add up. Jordan's calm demeanor wasn't matching the suspicion Mrs. Calloway was throwing at him. "Ma'am," one officer said, his voice professional, but with a hint of skepticism, "we'll look into it. But this young man is just doing a job. If he's hired by the Thompsons, there's no reason to make a scene." Mrs. Calloway wasn't having it. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her face twisted with frustration. "I'm telling you, there's something wrong here. You can't just let him walk around unchecked. He's got no business here." Jordan's confusion only deepened as he stood there, caught in the middle of a situation that made no sense. He'd worked for the Thompsons for months, and yet, to Mrs. Calloway, he was an intruder. The tension in the air was thick, and it felt as if every passing second was one step closer to something bigger than any of them could have anticipated. Little did Mrs. Calloway know, her quick judgments and baseless accusations were about to backfire in a way she never saw coming. What she didn't realize was that Jordan wasn't just any teen. He wasn't the stranger she thought him to be. No, Jordan had a secret she would soon learn, one that would turn everything upside down and silence her once and for all. As the tension hung heavy in the air, Jordan remained calm, his hands steady despite the weight of the situation. While the officers continued their questioning, his mind raced. There was only one thing to do: call his dad. Now, most kids in a situation like this might call their parents out of sheer panic, seeking comfort or reassurance. But Jordan's dad wasn't just any dad. Jordan's father was none other than the mayor of the town. A man who, for better or worse, carried a significant amount of influence in the community. Jordan pulled his phone from his pocket, tapping his dad's name into the dialer. It rang only once before his father's familiar voice answered. "Hey, champ," his father said warmly, unaware of the drama unfolding on the other end of the line. "What's up?" Jordan kept his tone even and calm, not wanting to alarm anyone further. "Hey, Dad. You might want to know that the police are here. Apparently, I'm suspicious." The officers, still standing nearby, exchanged a look at the mention of the mayor's name. It was subtle, but their posture shifted. There was a sudden change in their demeanor, a slight softening in their approach. They had no idea they were dealing with the mayor's son, and just hearing Jordan's casual mention of it told them everything they needed to know. The young man standing before them wasn't just some random teen. He had connections that could change the entire course of this encounter. As Jordan continued talking to his father, the officers, now visibly more respectful, looked at each other, unsure of how to proceed. One of them even stepped back slightly, as if trying to process the gravity of the situation. They hadn't realized who they were dealing with. Meanwhile, as if on cue, the Thompsons, Jordan's longtime clients, appeared from their front door. They had been alerted by the commotion and, hearing the voices, stepped outside to see what was going on. "We're so sorry about this," Mr. Thompson called out from the porch, waving a hand in Jordan's direction. "That's Jordan. He's been our trusted gardener for months now. We hired him. He's a good kid." The officers turned toward the Thompsons, their expressions now shifting from suspicion to understanding. They were starting to piece things together. As the Thompsons confirmed Jordan's identity, Mrs. Calloway, who had been standing at the edge of her yard, frozen in place, slowly came to a horrifying realization. Her accusation, made out of nothing more than a hasty assumption, had just backfired in spectacular fashion. Jordan wasn't just any teenager she could pick out of the crowd. He wasn't a stranger or a troublemaker. He was a young man who, unbeknownst to her, held an important connection in the very town she had just moved to. At this point, you could practically hear the wheels turning in Mrs. Calloway's head. Wait a minute. Is there a refund policy for bad decisions? Because this one's definitely non-refundable. As her face went pale, she stood there, frozen, realizing the magnitude of her mistake. The officers were no longer looking at her with suspicion. They were looking at her with barely concealed disbelief. And Jordan? He remained calm, his voice still even, as he finished the call with his father. The moment was no longer about a teenager just trying to earn a few bucks. It was about to become a lesson in the consequences of quick judgments and the unexpected consequences of a simple call to the police. Within what seemed like mere moments, a sleek black car rolled into the neighborhood, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon sun. The vehicle came to a smooth stop, and the door swung open. Out stepped none other than Mayor Henderson, Jordan's father. With the grace of someone accustomed to the spotlight, the mayor surveyed the scene, his demeanor calm yet resolute. He exuded the kind of confidence that only someone in a position of leadership could. There was no panic in his step, no urgency in his voice, just a quiet authority that carried a weight all its own. Approaching the officers, Mayor Henderson didn't waste any time. He immediately asked for an update on the situation, his voice steady and commanding. The officers, who had already undergone a shift in attitude after Jordan's phone call, now stood a little straighter. They explained what had happened, detailing Mrs. Calloway's suspicions and how they had arrived at the scene. But before they could say much more, Mrs. Calloway, still on edge and determined to defend her actions, interrupted. She shot forward, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and denial. "I was just protecting the neighborhood," she exclaimed, almost pleading. "He looked out of place. I thought, well, I didn't know who he was." It was as if she had rehearsed that defense in her mind, though it sounded more like an afterthought. She tried to justify her call, but it was clear from the mayor's expression that her reasoning was falling on deaf ears. Mayor Henderson turned to face her, his eyes locking onto hers with a piercing gaze. There was no anger in his voice, but a sharpness that made his words hit hard. "Out of place?" he repeated, his tone biting but measured. "My son was hired to do an honest job. You, however, seem to have jumped to conclusions without a second thought. Your actions, Mrs. Calloway, say far more about you than they do about him." The weight of his words hung in the air, as the residents of the neighborhood, who had begun to gather around, drawn by the commotion, watched the confrontation unfold. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The mayor wasn't just defending his son, he was calling out the hasty judgment that had led to this mess. And the truth of the situation was finally becoming clear to everyone involved. Mrs. Calloway's face flushed a deep shade of red, her earlier bravado draining from her as she realized the full extent of her mistake. The very people she thought she was protecting her neighborhood from were in fact the ones who had been wronged. Her attempt to be the vigilant neighbor had only exposed her prejudices. As the mayor stood tall, his gaze steady, Jordan quietly observed the scene. Though he had no desire for conflict, there was a quiet sense of justice in the air. His father's words, sharp and true, carried a weight that couldn't be ignored, and in that moment, it was clear that Mrs. Calloway's misplaced assumptions would cost her far more than she could have imagined. Word of what had just transpired spread faster than wildfire through the quiet suburban streets. As the flashing lights of the police cars faded into the distance, the murmurs began. People peered out from behind their curtains, stepped off their porches, and gathered in groups. Neighbors exchanged looks, some with concern, others with curiosity. The Thompsons, who had witnessed the entire ordeal, were furious. They stormed outside, ready to defend their young gardener. Mrs. Thompson, normally a kind and reserved woman, was beside herself with anger. "That's it! No one messes with Jordan," she snapped, her voice shaking. "He's more trustworthy than most people I know." Her husband, a quiet man, nodded in agreement. They had hired Jordan for months, watched him work diligently in their garden, and trusted him implicitly. They weren't about to let some stranger tarnish his reputation. Other neighbors, having heard the commotion, began to join the group. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others shared their own experiences with Mrs. Calloway. "She's always been a bit overly cautious," one neighbor remarked, shaking her head. "Always watching people, questioning their intentions. Never seems to give anyone the benefit of the doubt." Another neighbor added, "She's made a habit of calling the cops on anyone she doesn't recognize, even if it's just a kid selling cookies." It seemed that Mrs. Calloway's reputation for jumping to conclusions wasn't exactly new to the neighborhood. But as the crowd gathered, the focus shifted back to the mayor, who had remained calm throughout the ordeal. Standing tall with his arms folded, Mayor Henderson took a moment to address the growing crowd. His voice carried far enough for everyone to hear, his words clear and purposeful. "We all have a responsibility to treat one another with respect, regardless of appearances," he said, his tone measured but resolute. "It's easy to make assumptions about people based on what we see, but that doesn't give us the right to judge them. Especially not in this community." There was a brief silence, and you could see a few people nodding in agreement. It wasn't just a simple lesson in tolerance, it was a call for reflection. The mayor's words weren't just aimed at Mrs. Calloway. They were for the entire neighborhood. The incident was a reminder that prejudice, in any form, could easily slip into our judgments if we weren't careful. Mrs. Calloway, meanwhile, stood off to the side, her face crimson with embarrassment. She had clearly expected this to be a small, quickly forgotten misunderstanding, but the weight of the mayor's words and the silent judgment of the neighbors had made it clear this wasn't something she could just sweep under the rug. Though she muttered some apologies, they seemed hollow, like she was simply trying to escape the scene rather than genuinely acknowledge the harm she'd caused. Some neighbors accepted her apology, while others remained skeptical, their eyes cold. But just as it seemed the dust was settling and the situation was about to be put to rest, Jordan stepped forward. His calm demeanor had been a consistent presence throughout the ordeal, and now, as he stood there with the crowd's eyes on him, he spoke. His voice was steady, yet there was a glint of determination behind his words. He didn't raise his voice, but he didn't need to. With one simple sentence, he delivered a twist no one saw coming, and just like that, the entire neighborhood, still holding their collective breath, waited for the final reveal. Despite the embarrassment Mrs. Calloway must have felt, Jordan took an entirely different approach. Instead of holding a grudge, harboring anger, or publicly calling out someone, he chose to rise above the situation with a surprising level of maturity. A few days later, Jordan stood in front of a crowd of reporters with a smile that seemed to embody the calm after the storm. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. No, he had a bigger idea in mind. One that was far more powerful than any public apology or reprimand could ever be. Jordan had decided to turn this experience into an opportunity to bring the community together. With the support of the Thompsons and other neighbors who rallied behind him, Jordan announced a new initiative. A community project designed to bridge the gaps between neighbors, promote understanding, and foster trust. He called it Neighborhood Unity, and its goal was simple: to bring people together in ways that transcended petty judgments and assumptions. It's easy to look at someone and think you know who they are based on their appearance or where they're from, Jordan said during his announcement. But what we really need is to get to know each other. To see the person behind the lawnmower or the garden tools. We all have more in common than we think. His words were humble, yet they carried weight. And just like that, a teenager, who had just been falsely accused of wrongdoing, was now inspiring his community to think differently. What started as an accusation of suspicion had blossomed into something far more profound. When reporters asked him about Mrs. Calloway, Jordan's response was as graceful as it was wise. "I hope she learns from this," he said, looking thoughtful. "Sometimes people just need a second chance to do better. We all make mistakes, and it's important to give each other the opportunity to grow." You could hear the collective gasp from the crowd. Here was a young man, in the face of unwarranted suspicion, offering forgiveness and a lesson in empathy. His approach wasn't just about moving past the incident, it was about using it as a stepping stone to improve the community as a whole. I mean, who knew a teenager with a lawnmower could also be a natural politician, right? Maybe he'll be running for mayor one day, just like his dad, but with the heart and wisdom of someone who truly understands the value of community. Jordan's initiative quickly gained traction, with neighbors eagerly signing up to participate. They held cookouts, community cleanups, and events where people could come together, share stories, and put their differences aside. And while Mrs. Calloway may have initially felt the sting of her mistake, she couldn't help but notice the ripple effect Jordan's actions had on everyone else. It wasn't just a project anymore, it was a movement, and all it took was one teenager, a lawnmower, and the kind of character that most adults could only aspire to have. This story isn't just about a misguided phone call. It's about resilience, accountability, and the power of turning a negative moment into something truly positive. It's easy to fall into the trap of making snap judgments based on appearances, circumstances, or even the way someone carries themselves. But as Jordan proved, we have the power to rise above our assumptions and make a conscious choice to see people for who they truly are, not just for what they seem to be at first glance. What started as an embarrassing mistake, a phone call that was based on fear rather than fact, became a turning point. Jordan didn't let the incident define him, nor did he seek revenge. Instead, he took an unfortunate situation and used it to inspire change, to build something stronger than the misunderstandings that led to it in the first place. His response wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about growth. So, the next time you see someone mowing a lawn, or doing anything else that might seem out of place, ask yourself, are your assumptions fair? Are you allowing yourself to make judgments based on the surface, or are you willing to take a step back and recognize the story behind what you see? Kindness, after all, doesn't just change neighborhoods, it changes lives. It's a simple act, but one that can ripple out into something far bigger than we ever expect. So, whether it's helping a neighbor or offering a second chance, remember that your actions have the power to make the world a better place, one thoughtful choice at a time. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us share more stories like this one, and together, we can keep making the world a little more understanding, one story at a time. See you next time.